because I'm confident that the material in this book, plus my more recent insights into traditional publishing, independent publishing, and the horror genre as a whole, will be beneficial. So welcome to what I'm currently calling Retro Reads. It's a sort of podcast for horror fans, writers, and livers? I was going to say livers of life in general. That sounds really weird. Quick story for you. When I was trying to remember exactly how old I was when this happened, but probably, I'm guessing 6th or 7th grade, my mom got me a copy of Stephen King's Danse Macabre. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. If you have a different pronunciation, by all means, let me know. But at the moment, we're calling it Danse Macabre. This originally came out in 1981, right? Is that the first edition? Yeah, first edition was 1981. And I remember my mom giving me this book, and I was so excited because it was Stephen King, and she knew I was a Stephen King fan, so that was great. And then I opened it, and I was like, wait a minute, what's going on? This is weird. And then I realized it's nonfiction. And as a young reader, I was very upset that this was nonfiction as opposed to fiction. And it's one of the few books I ever got rid of. Just completely, I donated it, or I don't know, recycling wasn't a thing when I was a kid, so, except for, like beer cans. So I got rid of it, and it was gone for years and years and years. And then at some point when I was older, as an adult and as a writer, and it might have even been after I became a published author, I don't remember, I somehow re-encountered it and went through it and fell in love with it. And I've got this book, which I clearly bought used somewhere, and then at some point someone as a gift gave me a copy of the audiobook on CD, which is great because it's hard to find streaming. I had it on the library for years and years and years, and then it just vanished, and I can't figure out why it vanished. Despite multiple attempts to get them to repurchase the book, they haven't. So I bought some CDs, or some CDs were given to me as a gift. So I have 2 different copies of Danse Macabre. Danse Macabre is King's sort of deep dive into horror, but it's kind of almost a history and his personal take on the genre as a whole, which is why I like it so much. And it certainly is a plan I have someday. There's a very specific niche topic on horror that I want to dive into. I haven't done it yet. I've just taken some notes. I'm busy doing other things, like trying like hell to make a living with my writing, which let's talk about that someday. But it's a really cool idea. It's really fun. It's something I want to do for myself, not necessarily something I'm worried about making a lot of money doing, which I imagine is what King was doing when he wrote Danse Macabre. So the goal and purpose in doing this, I'm not going to read a lot, and I'm going to stop and go. This isn't meant to be some kind of narrated audiobook thing. And as we go from literally page 1 through each section, I'm going to be commenting on the writing process, the monsters, the horror, the other topics that he brings up, how that has impacted my career, how it might impact your career, or how it might impact you as a viewer, as an enjoyer of this particular genre that we all know and love so much. And we're just going to see where it goes, and because it's fun. So let's just dive in. Stephen King's Danse Macabre, copyright 1981. This is literally, what is this called? There's a term for this. It's not a prologue. It's like is it an epigraph? It's the first page, very, very literal first page. No page numbers or anything, just a couple of paragraphs pulled from the book. I want to say epigraph. I'm going to have to look that up, because I don't remember exactly what it's called. But it's from the book, and this is King writing, and he opens with this. Or rather, I should say, let's clarify that right now. This is not King opening the book. It is King's publisher opening with the book, because it is highly unlikely that, whether at this point in his career or any other point in his career, honestly, I don't know, we've never met, that this is a decision the design team made for the book. And that's something a lot of readers maybe don't understand, and don't need to understand necessarily, about authors, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is the likelihood that the author said, ooh, let's put this on the first page, is very, very low. God, I haven't even started the book, and already we're telling stories. For example, my novel Mercy Roll, which was published in 2018 by Sky Pony, a division of Sky Horse. I had a very, very specific requirement for how the beginning of the book physically looked as soon as a reader opened the pages. And it goes against, by the way, the traditional manner in which books are laid out and the way books are designed. My publisher and my editors, fortunately, they didn't fight me too much on it. There was a little bit of pushback, but when I explained why I wanted it that way, they gave in. And reach in here. So with Mercy Rule, the very, very, very first page, literally the first page of the book, is a quote, if you will. Do not go to school tomorrow. The very next page, this is without any page numbers. How come? Are you ditching? Ditching is bad for you, you know. Next page, just don't. And this is a text exchange between two students who are two of the principal protagonists in the novel. And it was designed to have a very specific impact on the reader. I think it did, because Mercy Rule is fairly highly regarded as far as I know, for at least for the people who read it. But anyway, those are choices that most of the time the editor or the design team or whomever at the publishing house will make those decisions. So in this very first page, back to Stephen King, it is unlikely that he decided, oh, use these quotes from the book for the very first page. I recognize terror as the finest emotion, and so I will try to terrorize the reader. But if I find that I cannot terrify, I will try to horrify. And if I find that I cannot horrify, I'll go for the gross out. I'm not proud. Here's the final truth of horror movies. They do not love death, as some have suggested. They love life. They do not celebrate deformity, but by dwelling on deformity, they sing of health and energy. They are the barber's leeches of the psyche, drawing not bad blood, but anxiety. And that is a quote from the book from Stephen King. I'll read the back just so that we can kind of set the stage here. The back of the paperback says, in his most unusual bestseller, the man who knows better than anyone else in the world what scares us and why takes us on his personal and terrifying tour of the dark ballroom of horror itself. Take his arm, let the dance begin. So there we go. That's Danse Macabre. It can be important. It can be revealing to put books into their context. Who was Stephen King in 1981? What was he doing? Where was he in his life? Well, he'd had several hits by then. Carrie, for sure, I believe. Salem's Lot had already come out by then. So whatever his first 3, 4, or 5 books were, he was already an established name in this genre by the time Danse Macabre came out. But he was also high as a kite. I don't know all the personal details. I was not there, but certainly just from cultural awareness, he had a drug problem, he had an alcohol problem, so he's writing this stuff under those auspices, seems the wrong word, but he's writing under those circumstances, okay? It's a term we use in theater. You're given circumstances. So should we bear in mind where he was in his career, in his personal life, in his physical life, how healthy was he, things like that? Yes. Should we look at the book with those circumstances in mind? We can. It may offer insight, but I don't believe it's necessary. That's just a personal opinion. Books like this, any book, can certainly be read and enjoyed just as it is. We do not have to apply different schools of thought and different lenses and different, interpretations based on this, that, or the other thing. We can just enjoy the book. Okay? So, for the moment, I intend to just enjoy the book. If there is some framing or lens through which I think it's important to look at what he's saying, then I will dive into that. But for the time being, let's just move ahead and enjoy the book for what it is. Okay, the next few pages are several... You know what? I think I might read those. We've got 2 pages full of reviews from various publications. So let's just read through them and see if anything pops up. And if not, I will cut it in the edits. First one. A labor of love. King knows what things scare people, and he has a pretty good idea of why. He connects the content of horror stories with the real terrors of everyday life. Those who have never seen a horror film or read one of the books he discusses can still come away from Danse Macabre with a sense of pleasure and enlightenment. That's from the Washington Star. I would agree with that. I think it's a stretch. I just don't think most people who are not already horror fans are going to pick up this book on their own or even by the recommendation of somebody and get as much out of it. I think it's possible, certainly. Like, considering my authorial relationship with my wife, for example, I will have her read things, whether it's something I am also reading or something I've written. She is a big part of my business of being an author. And if she ever asked me, well, why horror? Why do you write horror? This might be a book I would recommend. Like, you should read Stephen King's Danse Macabre. That'll give you a good foundation of why. But I'm not going to necessarily go to my way to recommend it to her because it's not her jam. This just isn't. Which, by the way, I would argue is what makes her such a great first reader for me, because she is looking at things and seeing things in my horror that horror readers are not, which I think is interesting. So anyway, moving on. Next one. Highly entertaining. King knows what he's talking about when the subject is horror. Considered by many to be our best current horror writer. Dallas Times Herald. I mean, yeah. Obviously, he is still writing. He's still producing. He's retired at least once, if not twice, in my lifetime. But he's still putting stuff out. I keep being told, this is, by the way, just for clarification, this is August 25th, 2024. In 2 days, I'm about to turn 50. That might be a lens through which we want to study why I'm doing what I'm doing. At this point in time, I keep hearing that, oh, horror is coming back in a big way. Horror is experiencing this resurgence. I don't see it. There are a couple of people who have broken through, certainly, and become sort of, culturally popular the way King did, several decades ago. But I don't know that means horror is experiencing some resurgence. I would also argue, and I will try not to repeat this every episode, horror never went away. Like, horror has been at the core of who we are since we invented language, since we were able to communicate, I would argue. Certainly as far back as, the Brothers Grimm, for example. Have you ever read the original fairy tales out there? Not the ones that were sanitized by Disney and all this other kind of stuff or rewritten later for us as Xers, but the old original fairy tales. That shit was gruesome, man. Those were straight up horror stories, right? And they're worth looking into. I have a book somewhere called Grimm's Grimmest, which is a sort of literal translation of some of the Grimm fairy tales. And they're brutal, dude. Like, Eli Roth, seriously, needs to get on board with old school fairy tales if he hasn't already. A24 should jump on that train, right? So horror has been around for a long time, and it never really goes away. Horror fans never go away. Sometimes there are elements of horror film in particular, sometimes fiction, that breaks through, quote unquote, and becomes a cultural kind of hit, but then it goes away, and then it comes back again. Then it goes away, then it comes back again. During those phases, horror fans still exist. Horror as a genre, both in film and in fiction and prose, not to mention poetry and even music, things like that. There's still an audience for it, and they are a dedicated audience. Okay, next one. Sent me off to the libraries and bookstores searching for the books under discussion that I hadn't read. It made me reread the ones I was familiar with. The irritating thing about Stephen King is that he can't discuss anything without offering new insights that force you to rethink your opinions. There's plenty in Danse Macabre to keep any horror fan satisfied. That is from the Jackson, Mississippi Sun. I agree with this assessment. And I think it is one of the things that I like about this book. I also have behind me here a variety of other nonfiction books about monsters and about the horror genre. A new one crops up every 3 to 5 years or so. They don't necessarily all say something new, but in the 3 to 5 years since the last one, a lot more material has come out. And so there's always something new to sort of mine to get into. And I agree with this reviewer's assessment. One of my favorite blogs and social media accounts is Mother Horror, and what Mother Horror does is just review and talk about and share horror novels. That's it. That's her jam. She also wrote a nonfiction book called, if I'm not mistaken, 101 or 1001 horror novels to read before you're murdered. Great book. Highly recommend it. And yeah, when I go through those books, no matter how old they are, 1981 to 2024, there is something new every time. You can go back and watch these movies and read these books and grasp something new from them, which I think is phenomenal. So anyhow, I definitely agree with that assessment. Next one of the best books on American popular culture in the late 20th century, Philadelphia Inquirer. Yeah, that's probably true as of 1981. Next one, Danse Macabre succeeds on any number of levels as pure horror memorabilia for longtime ghoulie groupies, as a bibliography for younger addicts weaned on King, that would be me, and as an insightful non-credit course for would-be writers of the genre. That's the Baltimore Sun. Yes, I would have to recommend that. That's something that as a horror writer, as an older, I should say, horror writer, is it's hard to keep up with so much content, particularly with the advent of the internet and social media and independent creators. There's just so much to keep up on. Like, never mind just trying to keep up with what comes out of the major Hollywood studios, which is not that much, right? But now you throw something like Tubi.tv on there, and like you are deluged with horror options. Never mind Kindle, never mind your local bookstore, never mind, any number of different fan fiction sites or independent publishing sites like Wattpad. Like, the options for the horror fan, for any fan of any genre, are endless. Endless. And so where do you start? For me, I would argue there is, for people who like horror, and I think they organically find this stuff anyway, go back to the beginning. Read the old classics, watch the old classics, understand where you come from. And so I love this phrase, younger addicts weaned on King, definitely me. I started reading Stephen King, I think, in 5th grade, if I'm not mistaken, and it was certainly either Skeleton Crew or Night Shift. And then an insightful non-credit course for would-be writers. Yeah, this is one of those things, if you're going to write horror, you need to know the stuff King is talking about in this book, which is why I have chosen to share it, which is why I'm hoping to do this on a weekly basis, because I'm confident that the material in this book, plus my more recent insights into traditional publishing, independent publishing, and the horror genre as a whole, will be beneficial. King is a real pro, guiding us through the fright factory as only an insider can. That's the Birmingham News. Yep. Okay, nothing to say there. Next one. To give you an idea of the feel of this book, picture yourself huddled close to a campfire in the midnight hours. King is a superb creative artist, the Houston Chronicle. Yes. I mean, it's important to note, for those of you who are readers, that this is not a scary book. I mean, it's nonfiction, and it is, academic is probably too strong a term, but it's nonfiction. It's not really creative nonfiction in the way that some of his On Writing was creative nonfiction. There were pieces of On Writing that were creative nonfiction. This is not really creative nonfiction. This is a study, but I wouldn't call it a textbook. It's not laid out like that. Danse Macabre is a conversation with Stephen King. It's comfortable and easygoing. At the same time, it's perceptive and knowledgeable, a visit with a craftsman who has honed his skills to an edge that cuts clean and sparkles with brilliance. That's the Milwaukee Journal. I would agree with that. It is a very conversational book. It's very easy to read. It's frictionless. One of my favorite words, frictionless. This is a word or a term that I believe all writers should embrace, whether they are writing hardcore literary fiction all the way down to your, bottom of the barrel genre. I crap this out in a week and put it on Kindle type of thing. Regardless of the genre, regardless of your style, it should be frictionless for the reader, at least within the context of the genre. There is such a thing, I think, as quote-unquote elevated horror. There's such a thing as elevated literature. Yes, I've read some. I've liked some, not all of it. Same is true of horror. But in any case, you shouldn't, as the creator, you shouldn't have any speed bumps for your reader or for the viewer. So frictionless is the take-home word of the day. And I think that's kind of what the Milwaukee Journal is saying here as a conversation with Stephen King. All right, 2 more, and then I think we'll call it a day because it's been longer than I thought. King knows the horror game, from film monsters with zipper suits to book monsters with seamlessly haunting presences. King opens up the best of the horror world. He conducts a lively tour of the deadly inhabitants of the obscure byways of horror. the Des Moines Register. That is a very clunky sentence. And that's, again, one of the fun things about the book is we're going to go down that road into, Burt I. Gordon horror flicks all the way through his own work, which is great. So it's fun. All right, here's the last one. A search for the place where we live at our most primitive level. The Chelsea, Michigan Standard. Search for the place where we live at our most primitive level. Yeah, I'll buy that. And this is something that maybe a lot of people don't know about King. Certainly the casual reader or the casual sort of the cultural, like, this is not something my wife would necessarily know, okay, because she doesn't really read horror. A lot of people don't know that Stephen King started off, number one, as an educator. He was an English teacher, I think a high school English teacher for a couple of years. He also was a scholar. He went to school and got his bachelor's degree in, I believe, literature, or at least English of some kind. When he was going to school, this is, I think, Carrie, was it Carrie was his first novel, I believe? Yeah, I think it was Carrie. Came out in 74? I think 72, something like that. So you gotta understand, he's going to school, and as far, again, this is off the top of my head. I didn't do any research on this. I apologize. I should do some next time. But he's going to school in the late 60s, early 70s, right? And he was reading stuff that we would now consider, sort of classic literature, and some stuff that was considered classic literature back then. And as I have watched him speak at events online and write books like Danse Macabre, like On Writing, you really start to appreciate just how deep his bench of knowledge of words and literature as a whole really goes. He talks about that in On Writing quite a bit, actually, and he's referencing stuff I've either never heard of or certainly never read. I'm like, but you're Stephen King. You're not supposed to read this classic stuff. You write horror stuff. It's garbage. It's, scary, blah, Pulp Fiction. And maybe it is, or at least some of it, but he's calling upon resources that go way back. Way back. And I think that's another important aspect for writers to be aware of, is to go back to those things and be educated in the literature. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. This went on a lot longer than I'd anticipated, but we haven't even gotten to the book yet. So I'm going to talk about that some more next week. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if there's anything else I can do, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care.